Welcome to the Gospel of Matthew. We're recording 3 sessions that I gave live in September of 2019. That was a long time ago. So what we're doing is we're offering them again in preparation for session 4 and 5 and maybe 6 as we continue with Matthew. We're giving them now because there's been such a long distance between September and now, which is May. And in order to understand what's going to happen in session 4 and following, it's important that we review what we've learned already about the context of Matthew. And for those of you who are not able to come to adult study to hear these lectures for the first time, what we've done, because they're audibles or audios, is we've added visuals to illustrate a lot of the things that I say. So we hope you enjoy it. For some of you, you can sit back and relax. For others of you, you may be sitting on the edge of your seat. And for others, you may have to wear a seatbelt. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Well, you might be very excited about the book of Matthew. It's been as you know, I have to suffer for it to be good. So I've been suffering for hours upon hours and weeks upon weeks because the material is new to me. Oh, how's that? Yeah, James laughing. It's new to me. And I wasn't very excited at all about doing the Gospel of Matthew. I just sort of thought, maybe I should do a Gospel. But, I like other things, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, or Second Temple Judaism, that's kind of good stuff. And I thought, well, the Gospel of Matthew, okay, it's going to be pretty boring. Just another Gospel, But I have to tell you that most of it is just new. And there's a reason for it. It isn't my fault. You know how those advertisements go, whatever's wrong with you, it's not your fault. But it's not my fault. Because when I went to seminary in the 70s, the information I'm going to share with you was not known. After the Holocaust, 1945, it took 20 years. In 1963, so 19 years later, did the Catholic Church do Nostra Aetate, which means in our day, where they claimed that the Jews were not responsible for the murder of Christ. First time in history, Christian history, 20 years after. What happened in the 70s? What happened with the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, there was a crisis in Christianity and in Judaism. And that crisis led some Christians to reevaluate its anti-Judaism. But it didn't have much to go on. It just thought, well, it evaluated things wrongly. It was partly responsible for what became the Holocaust, although not directly. So we're looking, look, Holocaust, Dead Sea Scrolls. I like the way these go together. And then in 1970, about then, Jewish and Christian scholars began to look at the Second Temple period. We know that as Christians mostly as the 400 years between the Testaments. The Bible is codified, and before the New Testament begins, there's 400 years. We used to call it the intertestamental period in the Lutheran context. And that's where you have your Apocrypha, which is, Luther took out of our Bible. Lutheran said it. I'm Lutheran. And some of those books are in your Bible, not all of them. Some of them are in the Apocrypha. But it's when the Jews say prophecy ended, the end of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures. Anyway, this whole thing of the Holocaust caused a new wave of things to happen. Christians looking at anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. What happened was, while people were looking at the Holocaust and anti-Judaism, so going back into our long history to look at how we've interpreted things, people wanted to start looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's Second Temple period. Wow. And from that, we learned some new things about what happened after the temple was destroyed in 70. What does this have to do with Matthew? Matthew was written somewhere between 80 and 100. always heard, once the temple was destroyed, and it's how we teach it in Christianity, Judaism was dead, the temple was gone, Judaism was dead, and the church superseded or replaced Judaism as the living religion. It was the true Israel. Okay, you've heard that before? You've never heard that before? Okay, well, let me tell you what you believe. The church teaches that after the temple was destroyed, there's no temple, there's no Judaism. And Christianity moved forward, became the official religion under Constantine, etc., and Judaism was dead. What I learned, and what they have learned, the authors I've been using, copyrighted 1997 and 2007, past my seminary years, past my preaching Matthew years, was what happened to Judaism after 70. And that there were no Christians yet. That you've heard me say before. But there was no Christianity for centuries. All followers of Jesus, all messianic movements, all other movements at all, they were all Jewish. And we're not used to that. We still say, oh, we're looking at the Gospel of Matthew, we're looking at a Christian gospel. And so what happened after 70? And that's kind of what I want to start with, because there's no way of understanding Matthew until we do that. What I'd like to start with is, I wanted to make that parallel between the 20 years needed after the Holocaust to get into changes that were taking place. The same thing happened after the temple was destroyed. Okay? It took till 80 or 90 for things to begin to start getting looked at, just like with Elie Wiesel and the Catholic Church. It took 20 years before people could get over the disaster, begin to think about living. The word Holocaust wasn't even known till decades later. I want to take you to a big Lutheran occasion, the Reformation. It can't be helped. Okay, so when you're looking at the Reformation, and I have two circles up here, we have Roman Catholic, Lutheran. Of course, there's more, but let's just say, in its most simple form, it began with Luther, even though it didn't. Okay, so you have the Roman Catholic Church and Lutheran. I have an X through that because never did you and I ever think that this was someone pagan against Christianity. Did you?
No.
That was Christian against Christian. They're together in a circle, and that's a Chi-Rho in Greek for Christ. And Roman Catholic and Lutherans and everybody else is an inter-Christian debate. Right? So, you and I look at Jews in the first century, and that's MT with the Chi-Rho, Matthew, and we see Matthew as Christian against the Jews. That's why I said it's the most anti-Jewish book in the Bible, according to Christians. Okay, you get what I'm saying?
Yep.
But, in essence, everybody here is Jewish. I want you to see it that way through this whole 3 weeks. Everybody is Jewish, everybody. Matthew is Jewish, and his audience is Jewish. He's the only gospel whose audience is Jewish. Jewish people that believe in the Messiah. But there's other messianic movements. Okay, there's others. And everybody here is a Jew. So it's the most Jewish book, and it's the most hard book on Judaism. It's an inter-Jewish fight. This fight is extremely important. It's extremely important to what happens then as this evolves. What happened in 70? First of all, the war began in 66. 4-year war of the Jews against the Romans for years. Hundreds of thousands dead. Josephus puts it at maybe 1 million. Oh, Lord. Almost 100,000 surviving Jews are sent to Rome as slaves. The temple is gone. There's devastation. What also happened here is there was loss and grief. Think about that. It's not just that it was destroyed and people were murdered and died, but there was a loss of the temple. That happened one other time, right? They went into exile. So what happens here? Well, a lot are dead. Some are in Rome. Many are in Rome. We always thought exile, they went in, those remaining, right? Well, there's slaves. But there were Jews that remained. So not all Jews went into exile. Wow, didn't we think they all went into exile and they came back in 1948? They went into exile, and then after 70 there were no Jews in Israel. There's never not been any Jews in Israel. Where did they go? Jerusalem is destroyed and ruined. Where do we hear about the Pharisees in the Gospels? We hear about the Pharisees in Jerusalem. And I want for your homework for you to read the Gospel of Matthew. With some of this in mind, okay? I want you to read it, and you'll find out in the Gospel of Matthew, the Pharisees are in Galilee in Matthew's Gospel. What? The Pharisees are in Galilee in Matthew's Gospel, except in the very end at the trial of Jesus, because he's using the book of Mark. He has Mark sitting in front of him, Matthew, while he's writing. The exact book of Mark, except for 60 verses, is quoted in Matthew. Just like Luke, when he opens up saying, I'm going to correct all the other Gospels, Matthew says, I'm going to do this right. Okay? Because what they wrote is not, because he's writing after Luke. So they go. Where do the Jews go? Well, guess where they go? Apparently, by this time, they also went to Egypt. So they fled. And they also went to North Africa. And they went back to Babylon, which is Iraq. There was already Jewish communities in all these places. And they thought, oh my gosh, I wonder how many Jews are in the diaspora. Between 6 and 9 million since the first temple destruction are in the diaspora already. They're all over what is now Europe. They're all over North Africa. They're everywhere in Europe. They're everywhere in Asia. Already. So it's not like, they went into exile. They all left Israel. Okay. And so the devastation and then the loss of people, the deaths, you can imagine the years that it took to come to grips with who are we? Who are we without a temple? Now I want you to go to Catholicism for a minute, as close as I can get to it. I want you just to go to Rome for a minute. And let's say that someone defeats and occupies Rome right now. Let's just say that. Because this is what this is about, right? Judaism to Jews. Israel is a sovereign country. And we'll get to that too, because it's part of what's important in Matthew. And it's been occupied since 335 before the Common Era. By first the Greeks, then in 60, late 60s by Rome, 63 I think, by Rome. All these defeats and battles. But let's just say that we're Catholic. Of course, I need to tell you that, when I go back to that little circles I showed you, Matthew's claiming to be the true Israel. So, and I've heard that. I thought that was supersessionism, the church replacing Judaism. But the Jews that survived here that weren't Matthew's Jews claimed they were the true Israel. It isn't about supersessionism. It's about Jews claiming to be the true Jews. Grasp that. It's a total reversal of what you've learned. Are you with me?
Yes.
Okay, because you look dumbfounded, which I expect. Okay. So, this is the Vatican stuff. Okay. So let's just assume that they're occupied, and whoever's occupied it says, Pope Francis, you're out, and we're going to put our guy as Pope. He's, not even Catholic, and he's Pope. And well, actually what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the idea of Pope at all. There is no Pope, and we're going to flatten and burn the Vatican. There are no archbishops, there are no bishops. There's no one to ordain new priests. And congregations around the world are saying, how do we go on as Catholics? Where's the canon law? Where are the laws made? Where are the encyclicals? How do we know what we're doing? There's no way to even have new priests. Now there's no communion. There's no communion in all of Catholic Christendom because there's no priests. You get rid of the priests, they have no power. And the priests have no power, and they're forbidden to give the sacrament. Imagine what your vestry would be talking about if it was Christendom. You'd be saying, how do we go on? Lay people can't give that way. We can't, so that's why I picked Catholic. Without someone saying you can give the communion, you can't do it. As a lay person in Catholicism, you have to be trained and approved of and all kinds of ceremonial things. And it's in canon law. And canon law has been destroyed. No one can read it anymore. It's forbidden. This is what happened. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the law was forbidden to be studied. There was no temple, so guess what there was none of? There were no priests. The temple was the center of Judaism. Did Jesus go to the temple? He went on the 3 pilgrimages, Passover, Sukkot, Shavuot. So he went for the booths, he went for Passover, he went with his parents. Did he go to get named to the temple? When he healed the leper, where did he go? He told the leper to go where? Now that you're healed, you have to go to the temple so the priest can ritually make you clean. I think the temple was kind of important to Jesus, don't you? And he overturned the tables there because they were selling stuff in the Gentile courts, and it wasn't against Judaism, it was against the temple. So for at least, like after the Holocaust, that's why I did that, at least for probably 1 to 2 decades, all Jews were living side by side. There was no different. The Romans looked at Messianic Jews, Jesus, and other Jews, Pharisees, Sadducees, looked at them as all Jews. And what happened before? They were all in synagogues. We see Jesus teaching in the synagogue. They were synagogues, so afterwards they're all synagogues that they're all worshiping. There's no difference between them. Well, there's differences, but they're all living side by side. Nobody's made a move yet to figure out how do we stay Jewish? Will Judaism survive? Or will it get rebuilt again? The big hope. Remember after the first destruction? They went into exile in Babylon, and what happened? Let them go back and they rebuilt the temple. Wow, will that happen again? So they're living in a limbo? How do we live until we know? And the decades are moving forward and nothing is... So that's what we see here. Here's the questions that we're looking at in this whole thing that pertain to the book of Matthew. Because he also is in Galilee, where the Pharisees went. Or is he in Antioch? They're not quite sure, but there's schools of Jews in both places, and both places are the same Roman province. Syria, Palestina. Same Roman province. So there's debate that will never be settled until new documents are found somewhere near the Dead Sea. And so he could be in either place. But he's born in the Galilee, Matthew. Actually, Matthew didn't write the book. None of the named people wrote the books. But if we look at who Matthew is, we know that he was born and lived in Capernaum. So his home is Galilee. So the questions they're all asking, Because the temple is the center of Christianity too. What we call Christianity, which wasn't. They were all Jews, that's why Jesus went. How do we survive too as Christians without the temple? Paul went to the temple. All the apostles went to the temple. Even after Jesus died, they went to the temple. How will the temple be rebuilt? How will Judaism survive? On what basis, if it survives, will it be considered legitimate? There's no temple. The temple authority were the high priests. Who told you the correct interpretation of the law? The high priests. Where was the Vatican? People who made decisions. The Sanhedrin. Where were they? They were in the temple. Is where they met. So, who will now have be our legitimate leaders? There are no priests. They're around, you know. The temple was destroyed. Doesn't mean they were murdered. They were Sadducees. But they had nothing to do. They were wandering around like everybody else. Okay? Trying to find their way. So it doesn't mean they all died. Who will have authority and how do we decide that? And who will relate to Rome? So you have two things going on. Will Judaism survive and we're still under occupation? Now when the temple was thriving, it was the Sadducees that collaborated with Rome, which was why there was such temple corruption as well. So who will now have the legitimacy to negotiate living with Rome? And ultimately, what will become the new Israel, the true Israel? Who will it be? And who will be left out of the story? Spoiler, Matthew's left out of the story. Wow, that shocked me too. And I know we have the gospel in it, but Matthew wrote his gospel. How do we know there was a Matthean community? Because he wrote a gospel. We don't know anything about the community except what's in the book. So we don't have where was this community and who was around. We don't know. But we know there was a community that followed Matthew after the late first century. He's written out of the story. He's fighting to be the legitimate, authoritative new Israel. Okay, so that's important. So anything you read that's anti-Jewish is anti what becomes this coalition group that we know little about. So while I looked endlessly for what happened between 70 and 90, there isn't any. Scholars look at Rome, they look at rabbinic literature that may say something about what happened before. But I had a poster up here of Second Temple literature, do you remember? Pliny, Philo, the New Testament, Josephus. That's it. Josephus doesn't tell us what happened after. He tells us the whole wars, what happened in the war, the devastation. What they're calling this period that I'm going to be talking about is a prolonged, a slow, an obscure development of what eventually becomes Rabbinic Judaism, hundreds of years later. Okay, so the year 200, if you've listened to any lectures I've ever given, 200, they become more solidified. They're not quite rabbinic yet with the Mishnah. So we won't get into defining that, but 200, the Mishnah is compiled by the sages that had lived, of what they had believed was the oral law. God at Mount Sinai actually gave Moses interpretations of what's not clear in the Torah. Okay? So as an example, and it's a good example, because you'll figure it out with my little circles sooner or later. In the Torah, it says, you should not work on the Sabbath day. That's it. The Pharisees are looking at each other and saying, what does that mean? What is work? Oh, what is work? How far can I walk? Gee, if you are a person that sews in your life, you can't lift a needle. That's work. Okay? And it gets elaborate. What you can do and what you can't do on the Sabbath. So what do we find with Jesus in all the Gospels? He's fighting with the Pharisees over what you can and can't do on the Sabbath. And we think Jesus is correct. But, nobody was correct. Not until things got codified in 2000 and 350. There were two Talmuds, the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud. And what they are is they took the laws and the oral traditions, what Jesus called the traditions of the elders, and that is today what it's still called. And he opposed that with the hand washing. And the Talmud are commentaries on the Mishnah. We're doing very good. We may even actually get to Matthew. But there's no way to understand Matthew without it. And once you understand Matthew without it, you're going to read on your own Matthew differently. So 70 is a time of grief, loss, chaos, bewilderment, disorientation, death, slavery, exile. And it goes on and on and on. Now, one thing I never looked into, ever, because we have the sects in our New Testament, don't we? There were the fat Sadducees, right? There were the Pharisees. We meet them in the New Testament. There were the Essenes, which we met when we studied Qumran. Okay? And then there's the Jesus movement. And then there's the aggressive Jews who want to get rid of Rome. That's your zealots. And then see the little ones here? I found out there's lots of other names. There's the fourth philosophy. I mean, there goes on and on and on, different groups that existed. They aren't named, but there were movements everywhere. There were little sects everywhere. It's incredible. Josephus will say so, unnamed. And how do we know they exist? Well, I don't know. I don't know, but here's what we do know. The only two groups of sects that we know something about from themselves are the Essenes and the Jesus movement. So what is Qumran all about? They had documents, right? They had an order of living. All that stuff that was found. Jesus, we have a whole New Testament. The Pharisees never wrote anything. We know about them from the bad things our Gospels say about them. That's how we know the Pharisees. They never wrote anything about themselves, so we never hear their point of view, right? And the Zealots never wrote anything, and no one else wrote anything, just two groups, the Qumran community and the Jesus community. The only ones that have documents. Why are there sects? I can't expect you to know, but if you do, I shall worship you. Anybody know when they started or why there are sects? Because when I started studying this era, I had to ask myself that question. That also was not easy to find. And when did they start? Now, this gets into all the occupations. Okay? The occupations are important because it's the occupations that create sects to be formed. Okay? Are you with me? Are you still interested in math? Because we're getting there.
Yes, we are.
Okay. We're getting there, and I expected this to take a while. We will get to at least one text. I'm not going to hand it out, but I want you to see what Matthew does versus Luke and what he does versus Mark. To make a very long story short, Alexander the Great in 335 conquered somebody, and Israel became under occupation. And what happened then is very significant because the Jews living under Alexander the Great did very well. They had their freedoms. They were allowed to continue their worship and all kinds of things. But one of the things that Alexander did was he Hellenized or made Jews into Greeks. So much so, over a couple of centuries, that they no longer knew Hebrew. And they were assimilated. They are assimilated so that The Hebrew scriptures, by some scholars, have to be written in Greek. It's called the Septuagint. We know that back from seminary. Okay, we had to even buy it at one point, and I sold it, I'm sorry to say. So it was the Hebrew scriptures in Greek, and that's how the Jews knew the Torah, in Greek. So they're secularized, and everything becomes secularized. Let me tell you how you're assimilated. Let me just say, every movie I watch, every soap opera, whether it's in Spanish or English, every movie, somebody says, what do you want for your kids? And you answer, what do you want for them? Success?
Safety.
Happiness?
Joy.
Joy. Okay, well, someone says, hey, a friend of yours says, what do you want for your kids? I just want them to be happy. I just want them to be successful. Ah, it's so Christian. Now, when you look in the Gospels, Paul, nowhere do you find those words. And Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations so that they'll be happy.
Be happy.
Be happy. And tell them, and what is it you want to do in the world the most? You want to be a doctor. Why? To make a difference. You want to make a difference? I want to make a difference. I'm going to be a lawyer so I can make a difference. I'm going to join Habitat for Humanity so I can make a difference. Well, nowhere does Jesus say, go, be baptized, and for goodness sakes, make a difference. They're non-Christian wishes for your children. That's assimilation. If you want a Christian response, you'd say, be faithful to God. Spread the word. In whatever you do, be a witness.
And love your neighbor.
And love your neighbor. Love God and love your neighbor. Who said that to their kids as they went off to college or when they graduated? Guess what? You now understand assimilation.
Yes, exactly.
Okay? That's important. Because we'll say, well, why didn't the Jews go back from Babylon? A lot of them just stayed in Babylonia. Why? They were assimilated. They built lives, built homes, had jobs. They were happy. Some came back. So what happened was, Alexander the Great's grandson hated the Jews. And he was poor. His empire was poor. What did he know? Where did he know he could find riches? Taxes, but he could tax all of his underlings. The temple. So what did he do? He authorized the army to go and loot the temple of all its gold, of all its silver. And guess where common Jews, like you common Christians, Catholics, kept your riches when there were no banks? In the temple. All of your savings, all of your gold, all of your silver, everything was protected, guaranteed protected in the temple. So he looted the temple. People were poor. And by doing that, he blasphemed the temple. And then he made the priests sacrifice pigs. And he forbade circumcision, reading of the Torah, observing the Sabbath. So what do you think happened? This is not the answer. What do you think happened? There were revolts. And I mean there were revolts. When we look at the revolt of 70 and think, wow, just 4 years of war. I can't tell you, and I don't think anyone actually knows, how many Jewish revolts there were under occupation right through. To have 9.11 Jews in the diaspora says a lot. And there were murders of thousands at a time, 6,000 here, 3,000 there, because people revolted and the army slaughtered them. And what else they did, Antiochus, what else he did is he said to the army, and you have the authority to take some booty, I want most of it, you can take some, and I want you to murder all the Jewish men and take all the women as slaves. So there were revolts. And he appointed his own person to the temple. That did it. That is the key. He usurped the right, like in the Catholic Church, right, the apostolic succession. He usurped that, and he placed his own person as the high priest. And he confused it by also making that person the king of the Jews. You don't have the king and the high priest as the same person. Then you get into the Maccabees, that war. Oh, come on, it goes on and on and on. And that's what came from this was the Maccabees, and then things got mixed up inside Judaism. And then these formed. They said, now our temple is corrupt. We heard Jesus say that. The Pharisees say it. The Sadducees say it. The Essenes say it. They all say it. So they all have that in common. All of them said the temple is corrupt. So they formed a group that said, we're going to tell you what's the right way to think, what's the right interpretation of the law. And they said, no, we're going to do that. No, we're going to do that. And the temple's so corrupt, we're just going to move ourselves to the Dead Sea. Jesus is also anti-temple. And the Zealots were aggressive. They murdered Jews who disagreed with them. The Zealots killed so many Jews that opposed the war. So it was a slaughter. But before that slaughter, these groups that we read in the New Testament were there. They were sects. And the primary interest they had was, what is the correct interpretation of the law? And we'll read, I don't even know which gospel it's in. The rich young man comes to Jesus and says, so how do I get eternal life? And Jesus says, well, what's written in the law? It's interesting, you heard in the sermon this morning about love. Love, love, love. Like love as opposed to the law. Love is the law. What's written in the Torah, he asks. He says you should love God and with all your heart and soul and mind, and you should love your neighbor as yourself. Wow. And Jesus says, you're right. Go on, that's eternal life. Keep the law, love God, love your neighbor. That's Jesus. The law is important for the sects. Now, they're formed, and here we go. They're formed because there is a temple that's corrupt. Where are they when there's no temple? I told you that only 2 sects survived. What survived are no sects. They had no reason to be. There's no temple. That's why there's the confusion and the bewilderment. Who will be the authority? And what do we do now? Because these people were really in charge, and they gave the true interpretation according to them. So where are they now? And I never knew there were no sects. Now, it doesn't mean they all dispersed. They were groups of people. But they no longer had this reason to be. Now they were just wandering and saying, well, we wanted to be the true people. We wanted to be true. But there's no one now to be true to. What's the correct interpretation of the law? Well, the group that is the most popular, has the most organization, becomes the one, and we call it that the Pharisees evolved here, right? It's a Pharisaic movement, became the future called Rabbinic Judaism. Guess what? The Pharisees never, ever, after the destruction of the temple, referred to themselves as a sect. Never is the word Pharisee used in any literature after the 70s for the Pharisees. So they are the dominant group of Jews. And you know what that means? Out of millions of Jews I've just talked to you about, that means there were 6,000 of them. Every one of these groups is teeny. Okay? Every one is teeny. There's this masses of regular Jews keeping the Sabbath and doing what they know. Okay? So these are teeny little sects. And they actually they're still here, but they're not effective anymore, put it that way. Okay, they gather, but they're asking the same questions, and so is Matthew. Because his audience is Jewish. So Matthew says to himself that he is the true Israel. Well, Qumran's already dissolved, they're destroyed, they're murdered, they're gone with the destruction of the temple. There's just teeny little movements. Actually, some new ones start. And how do we know it? Like we know Matthew, they wrote books. We don't know anything about them. 2nd Baruch, 4 Ezra. I never knew these before. They're Messianic. They're Jewish Messianic groups that form. So one of the things that happens with the destruction is people think it's the end of time. They're waiting for the Messiah. It's a Jewish thing to wait for the Messiah. So Matthew's group is just one of those Messianic groups. We don't know how big, how little. We know that it survives only because in the 4th century, Christians decided to pick up the book of Matthew and make it something. This book meant nothing in the first part of the 2nd century. And then it's disappeared. I talked about the Sabbath, right? And we know the story of who plucked what on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees come along, right? So let me read from Mark. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing that? It is not lawful on the Sabbath." And Jesus said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God when Abiathar was the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for anyone but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who went with him." And what does Mark say about that? He has Jesus conclude, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, so that the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now, if you pay close attention to that, because Luke is just almost ditto, so I won't read Luke. Luke takes it from Mark. What he's really saying is, there's a precedent. And it was David, a king, not a priest. It was unlawful, but it's a precedent. And besides, God is the Lord of the Sabbath. And then in the end, it's Jesus. And so the Son of Man is even Lord of the Sabbath. So just because I said so, right? There's a precedent, and besides, the Lord is, Lord of the Sabbath. Now listen to Matthew. "Have you not read in the law, how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is happening here. And if you had known what this means," is that a criticism of the Pharisees? "And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless." Now he's saying they're guiltless. The other, Luke and Mark are saying there's a precedent. Matthew is saying they're guiltless, and he ends, "For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." I'm putting a few of you to sleep. I said, I've never done that before. 1, 2, 3, okay. I know, it's hard to teach this, but I hope you're grasping it. Okay, and I pray that those eyes that are closed are listening intently. But listen to what he says. "Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath? Because they have to make sacrifices on the Sabbath." Now remember, and they are guiltless, or they're not really guilty, because they're asked to do something which they aren't supposed to do. You must break the law to keep it. So what he's really saying, the priests who keep the law are demanded that they make sacrifices on the Sabbath, but they're guiltless. And therefore he is really justifying Jesus' action. Not just saying there's a precedent. Matthew has these debates about the law, and he says, this is what Matthew says, this is where we come now to after the temple. There is no temple, and you guys over there, starting with the Pharisees, you guys think you are trying to find, the legitimate authority who has the right interpretation, but it's Jesus who has the right interpretation. That's Matthew's position. So what Matthew does is he divides his gospel into the five books of Moses. Guess who is the new Moses? And I will show you next week how Matthew, and you can look it up yourself, see if you find it, where Matthew makes Jesus Moses 5 different times. 5 different times he makes what happened to Moses happen to Jesus. to make him the one who has authority. And he wants you to know it, that I've done it in five discourses. Okay? The first is the Sermon on the Mount. There's an exit formula, so that you know it's the end of the first book of Moses. The exit formula is when Jesus had finished saying all these things. And it's not exactly the same, but it's always when Jesus had. The second discourse, following after 28, is the apostolic instructions. So you have the law, instructions. The exit formula is 11:1, and it's something like this. The third discourse is the parables of the kingdom, and there's where they are located. And the exit formula is here, so you can look it up, and it looks like that. That's kind of something, isn't it? And the fourth is the laying down of the law, Matthew 18, 1-35. The exit formula is, again, the same as before. And so you know it's finished. That book is done. The next book, the Apocalypse, and the exit formula, and we have 5 books. But it doesn't end the gospel, nor does Matthew 5 begin the gospel. So what are the bookends to the 5 books of Moses? And that is the birth, genealogy and birth of Jesus, and his crucifixion. Jesus, who is the new Moses, who will interpret the law correctly. And Matthew wants his community to be the Jewish community, to be the true Judaism. Now that you know more about Matthew, I will do that center part. What is formative Judaism? What is it doing that Matthew is responding to? Matthew's responding to formative Judaism. We'll get into that next week. Try to stay awake. After the destruction of the temple in 70, Judaism was in crisis. Would it survive? Would it disappear? What would it look like? This is the drama we see unfolding in the Gospel of Matthew. And Matthew has his own idea. He says, our community is the true and the new Israel. Jesus is the Messiah, and only Jesus has the right interpretation of the law. Well, other rabbis had other ideas. The stage is now set for Matthew to defend his position and to attack his opponents. Stay tuned for session 2.